Hi, welcome back to Christine's Home Affairs. It's another alteration job today, and this time it is a pair of jeans. So these ones are your regular denim jeans. There's not very much, there's barely any stretch in them at all. So hang around and I'm going to show you how to hem these jeans. They're quite simple to do and they don't take long at all. Okay, first of all, before we start, the needles that I'm going to be using for this job are 110 or 18. Now I use an industrial machine, so ignore the dB by 1 because that's for my straight stitch machine. You want this number here, the 110-18. It's a really good strong needle which will help prevent needle breakages when you're sewing over thick seams. So I like to use a number 18 or 110. The thread that I'm using is a Gutermann top stitch thread, the M782. It's a heavier weight thread than your regular Gutermann cotton, and it's close enough to the original stitching that is on the jeans. And it's a really good strong thread as well. It's really difficult to break this. That doesn't mean to say you can't use regular sewing cotton. For years I used to use just regular Gutermann sewing threads for my hems. The stitching line was a little bit thinner, but that really didn't matter. My customers didn't complain. And for years when I was using my regular domestic sewing machine, I would just use a size 14, a 90/14 universal needle or a jeans needle. So it's only since I've gone to industrial that I've started using really heavy needles. I'm not sure what's available for domestic machines. So you can do these hems with a regular universal number 14 needle, or a jeans needle would be better. Okay, let's get started. The customer has already pinned the finished hem here. So I do like to just make a mark at the finished hem length, just in case I lose my pin. This hem here is only just over 3/8 of an inch, or about 1.2 centimetres. I usually do my hems with a 5/8 inch hem, so I'll do a double fold at 5/8 of an inch. That means that I actually need 1¼ inches. 5/8 of an inch is 1.5 centimetres, so I would double that to 3 centimetres to give me that double fold over. Now the reason I do that is because I find that these hems are awkward to turn over when they're really small. They also sit better when they're a little bit longer. The jeans that come in for alterations, the hems vary so much. Most of the time the hems that I get have that 5/8 inch hem. So I do like to stick with that length. So this is the finished hem length, and I need to take away the 3 centimetres or 1¼ inch hem. And this is my cutting line. Okay, so I'm going to have a double fold. There'll be a fold here and a fold here, and that's my finished stitching line. So when you're taking off the measurement for the amount of hem that you need to take it from the finished hem line. Once I've done that, then I'll come back here and measure that distance. So now I know that I need to cut off 1 1/8 of an inch, or 2.8 centimetres. So all I'll do now, it really bugs me when jeans come in with such wavy ends. All I'll do now is line up that cutting measurement along the bottom, and it's really difficult to get a straight edge when you've got fabric like this. So I'm actually going to turn over to the other side where it's a nice straight edge, and I'll use that as my guide. So this is my cutting line, and my finished hem line is up along here. Okay, I've got both legs lined up together. And just make sure that fabric is lined up evenly, and I'll go and cut through all of these layers. If it were too thick to cut, I would actually just go and measure the two legs separately. Coming up to the end there, it's a little bit difficult because I've got the seam underneath. So I'll cut that in separate layers, and that's it. Often I'll get hems where there's this much fabric left over. I always keep them. I'll cut off the end bits, and I keep those for patches when customers bring their torn jeans in for repairs. So I have a whole box full of scrap ends that I keep. Okay, now I will set my seam gauge at the 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimetres, and then I'll start folding. Start at the side seam first. Place a clip in the side there. This is the thickest seam of the whole garment, and this one I'll fold in half. And then I'll go back to the centre front and the centre back, measure those, and then measure the rest of the way around. So I've folded the first layer under, and before I go to the next step, I just want to show you something. On the other leg here, you've got this seam here, which is a really thick seam. There's nothing we can do about that. That's going to be a double fold. And this one here, you've just got an overlocked edge. What some people like to do is measure whatever their seam is going to be and say that's the hem there. They'll make a cut in here so that they can open out that seam along here, push that away to the opposite side, and then fold the fabric under, and then fold the fabric under again. And what that does is that helps distribute some of that thickness, because if you just fold it twice like this, you're going to have lots and lots of layers here. This is the thinner side of the jeans. I don't bother with this. I don't think it's necessary to do that. If it makes you feel more comfortable, then go ahead and do that. But this isn't the side that causes all the grief. It's this side here, so I don't feel like it's necessary to fold that piece of fabric over. As long as you can get over the really thick seam here and you sew carefully, you'll be right. And we'll go through that at the machine. So rant over, back to this one. It's single fold. All I need to do now is fold that fabric up on that raw edge, and then just pin or clip it in place. And you can see that's where my hem is. That's the marker for my finished hem. So I know that everything's going to be fine there. This is the side that's got the really bulky seam. It is going to be difficult sewing over it, but we can get there. Okay, both my hems are done, and I'm ready to take this to the machine now. Now that we're ready to start, place a magnetic seam guide on the bed of my machine. That's just so that I have a guide to follow. To determine where that needs to go, I'll place the hem underneath the machine and have a look at where the needle is, and then move my magnetic guide wherever it needs to go so that the needle is in the correct position. I'm not actually going to be sewing from this side. I'm going to be sewing from the right side. The reason for that is that there are so many layers here, and as you sew along, when you get to the seam here, the fabric has a tendency to push, and as you come to the seam, this will bunch up and create even more bulk at the seam section here. So I find that by sewing from the other side, that doesn't happen. But I've got my seam gauge in the correct place now. I know that my hem is going to be okay, even though I can't see it at the bottom. I'll start on a side seam, but I'm not going to start on the side seam where there's so much bulk. I'll go to the one with less bulk. And the only reason for that is that I'm usually really scared of my machine when it goes over the bulk seams. I will start just before the bulk of the seam, back stitch, and I'm going to sew slowly over the seam. Now at this point here, and particularly on the other side, you can see the foot of the machine starts to go up on an angle. With a lot of domestic machines in particular, this causes a problem, and this is where you get the problem with your needles breaking. The foot is going up like this, the needle is trying to go down as you're sewing. It's going up at a weird angle. The needle will hit your foot or just nick something, and it'll end up breaking the needle. So what you can use is a thing called a hump jumper. It's just a little plastic gadget with a gap in the middle, which is where the needle goes. If you don't have a hump jumper or access to one, they're very, very cheap products to buy. But if you don't have one, then just get some fabric and roll it up and make yourself a hump. And that can sit at the back of your machine whilst you're going over the bulk seam. Stop with your needle in the down position, raise your foot, place the hump jumper underneath with the gap here between the needle. There's a narrow side and a thick side. You just want to determine which side you want to use. That has now made my foot sit nice and flat, so that'll help when I'm actually going over the bulk of the fabric. If you're using a domestic machine, it's at this point I would actually hand crank over the bulk of the seam, but on an industrial machine, and if you're using a really heavyweight needle like I'm using, you shouldn't have any problems going over the seam. I'm using a 3.5 stitch length as well, so I like to have something a little bit longer. So I'm going very slowly. I will reinforce that. And the hump jumper will fall off by itself. And you can actually use this at the front as well. The foot is starting to go on an angle again. You can place the hump jumper in between with the prongs on either side of the needle, push it up against the seam, and that will help keep your foot nice and straight whilst you sew. So go very slow because you don't want to sew on this. So I'll do one more stitch. That will get my foot away from the bulk of the seam, and then I can continue to sew as normal. When I'm sewing this hem, what I'm watching is the edge of the seam guide and the edge of my hem. I'm not watching my needle. Okay, it's at this point here where we are at the worst part of the seam. I cringe every single time I go over these, and I know that the needle that I've got is good for my machine, so I need to get over it, but I still do cringe. I've broken so many needles. I'll reverse just before here. And had I been sewing with the fabric from the other side, this is where the fabric would have pushed up against the seam, and it just would have created so much more bulk. So I'm going to try and go as close as I can to the bulk of the seam, raise my foot, put my hump jumper underneath, and that straightened my foot, and I'll just grit my teeth and go slowly. Now, this is the part where I would definitely go and use my hand crank if you're using a needle that isn't quite strong enough. I just wouldn't recommend sewing automatically with your foot. You can see I'm not hand cranking. That's because I've got a size 18 needle, and I'm confident that the needle can go through it, but it doesn't stop me from going slow at that point. The hump jumper will flick out of the way. And you can place that in front again. Just hold it there while you do a few more stitches. You can remove that, continue on. And there is the hem nicely finished. So I'll go and do the other one now. So this one I'm going to do without the use of the hump jumper. This being an industrial machine, I don't really need to use it. Okay, the hem is completely finished now, so I can happily give this back to the customer. Although I've used the top stitch thread, which is thicker than your normal sewing thread, you can actually use regular sewing thread, and if you want the same kind of look as the thick top stitching thread, you can put 2 strands of thread through the needle and sew that double thickness thread that way. So another simple alterations project finished. I probably do about 10 hems a week. It's the most popular service I have with as far as my alterations go. The hump jumper is an invaluable tool to have in your sewing space. They're only a few dollars to buy, and they'll save you loads of money, frustration and time by not having broken needles when you use something like this. So if you don't have one, get yourself one. They're great for all sorts of things, not just for jeans. Anywhere that you have a bulky bit of seam or any bulk that you want to start off with, put the hump jumper behind, it'll level out your foot, and then you can start sewing without any problems. For jeans, I charge $15 a pair. I don't have any problems with that. Whether the customer brings in 6 pairs or just 1 pair, they get charged the same amount all the time. But the more you get in one go, the better it is for your productivity, so you can actually earn a better income when you do lots and lots of jeans at the same time. I've got to say, even though I've been doing these hems for years and I've been using the really strong needle that I told you about, I still cringe every time I go over the thickness of the seams on the jeans. I grit my teeth, and I'll actually sit back as well, just in case the needle breaks and goes flying in my face. It still terrifies me, but it's actually taught me to take my time and go slow. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I shall catch you next time. Bye for now.